So today's passage and sermon is it was entitled "Strangers in a Strange Land," but I want to, from the outset, say that look, this is so totally not what Peter is actually talking about in this letter, in this passage. I think Peter, if he was actually terming it, would have actually called it "Strangers in a Familiar Land." And as we go through, I think you'll actually see what I mean with this in the passage. But before we do that, it's worth noting this is the third of six-part series that we're doing in 1 Peter. And I want to suggest that as we swim our way through 1 Peter, that we just pop up at the start, put our heads out, not just to take a breath, but actually to scan our situation. Where has Peter been taking us and where is he leading us? Where have we come from? So that we actually context the passage properly. 1 Peter, there's lots of different ways that people actually will put a structure on it. But I think the simplest way that we can do it is to start. Peter has an introductory session, which comes in the first chapter, unsurprisingly. And verse 3 really sums that up for us. Praise be to the God and Father, our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And so this is Peter's first bit. He's really pushing it, is God gives mercy. And the whole hinge of his letter then comes in chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. And so Peter's taken the whole idea that he started his letter with, that God gives mercy, and he's now making it clear that Christians receive God's mercy. Now, the rest of the letter, starting from verse 11, which is our passage today, is all about the application. How do we respond to having received God's mercy? And I think that's a really important thing for us just to remember as we go through, not to just try and take this application in its own meaning. We need to really hook it back to that hinge section that Peter has. So what's the context to this? Well, Peter is writing to a group of churches in sort of modern day Turkey, and they were predominantly Gentile converts, and they're still living in their pagan world that they've called home for all of their lives. But they've changed, they're different. And because of this, they're experiencing persecution. Now, this isn't necessarily the persecution that we can immediately think of from the 1st and 2nd centuries of Christians being thrown to the lions in the Colosseum, but there is certainly persecution going on. They are being ostracised, they are being excluded. People are really suspicious of them because they're doing things differently. They're no longer worshipping the gods of the region. They're no longer doing those things. And that's really suspicious. That makes people feel uncomfortable. What is going on? And so they're under suspicion, they're being watched, they're being excluded. And, if you've ever had to live through the unfortunate bit of being pushed to the outer, being excluded, you know that that is not a comfortable place to be, and that's not an enjoyable place for where these first Christians are in a society which is actually very familiar to them. Just to give you a bit of an idea, if you think back into Acts 17, it talks about in Thessalonica where Paul and his companions were accused of rebellion. This was the whole bit. They were viewed with such suspicion that they're being accused of rebellion and sedition against the emperor for talking about there being another king, Jesus. So there is all sorts of persecution at that level that they're going on. But there's an added thing that you can probably pick up there as well. They're living in the same circumstance they've always lived with. Yet, and all those attractions, the things they used to have done all their lives are there. How easy is it for them to slip back? And this is where Peter is encouraging them and saying to live purposely, to live as aliens, to actually recognise you are different. You do need to live differently in your circumstance, even though it is so familiar, even though it is so easy to slip back into your old patterns, your old ways of living. You need to actually they need to have their attention on Christ. Now, I don't know if any of this is familiar to you. How many of you have lived most of your lives, if not all of your lives, in Canberra? How many of us have felt those pressures to conform to society? Why aren't we doing things differently? Why are you spending Sunday morning at church? Why don't you use the same sort of language? Why aren't you partaking in lewdness? Why aren't you involved in casual sex or gossip, being judgmental? Or whether everyone minimises their tax. You're crazy if you pay all your tax. Is it wrong to be obsessed with our superannuation and being wealthy and financially independent, being irritable, being impatient? Hopefully some of those sins are easy to recognise. I know I struggle with some of those because they're insidious. They're something that we've experienced all our life, and some of them, even some of those more respectable ones, seem like they're actually almost okay. But I think Peter's letter is timeless in this regard, that it's speaking so closely also to our own circumstances as we get suspicion from society around us as to what are we actually doing as Christians and why aren't we doing the same things that everyone else is doing. And so Peter is calling us to live a different life, to live a holy life for God. Now, that's kind of easy though. If you're a bit like me, you can read there and say, well, that's okay for you, Peter. You're an apostle. You had it made. You had it sorted out. My life's different. Even if I can do good, I can't change people. I can't have an impact. I'm not in Parliament. I'm not a social media influencer with thousands of followers on Instagram or Facebook. How can I change things? How can I have an impact in my life? Well, unfortunately, Peter does not let us off the hook easily at all in this circumstance. Because the two groups that Peter goes to in his letter and the passage we've just read, slaves and the wives, are the two most unempowered groups of society in that time. Slaves had no legal right to anything at all. We can talk about slavery, that maybe some slaves had the benefit that they could effectively work off and pay off their cost and buy their freedom. But that was something that was definitely not universal. It came down to, was your owner that generous? And the owner was not actually beholden to it, could actually string you along anyway to the end. They had no legal right to anything at all. Many slaves were subject to sexual abuse, to physical abuse as it went through. So they were people with no legal recourse. Wives didn't have a lot better. So Peter turns to them and actually shows how the most unempowered can actually live and can actually do give that demonstration. With slaves, it's really interesting as he goes through. He talks about them living a good life, doing what they're told, suffering under the unjust punishment as they go through. And he uses what they call a Christological passage. That's verses 21 to 25, if you want to have a quick look in your Bibles there as you go through, just so you can see what I'm talking about. It's beautiful language of describing the suffering of Jesus Christ on the cross to pay the penalty for our sin. And Peter is drawing upon Isaiah 53, that passage we read, with the famous bit of the suffering servant that Isaiah foretold, which was very much betraying Jesus. And this is Peter, who, if you remember back in Mark 8, got it so terribly wrong with Jesus that he recognized Jesus as the Messiah, but was insistent that Jesus was not going to suffer. Well, Peter has now got it. And Peter is sharing with slaves in that if you are downtrodden, if you are suffering unjustly, remember that that is nothing compared to what Jesus also suffered. And we, as his disciples, should expect to receive that same suffering. As one of the comments Byron made in our first sermon on this, suffering is not a bug in Christianity, it's a feature. Now, on slavery, I think it is important just to quickly call out here that you shouldn't actually read this as Peter endorsing slavery or saying that slavery is acceptable. Whilst Peter hasn't called it out and called it vile and evil, sinful, Peter is definitely not endorsing it, and the Bible is not. Peter's recognising that it's an endemic factor of his society where he lives. And he is certainly pointing to the way that they should live with that. And the Bible is quite explicit about, slaves should, if they get the opportunity, to actually leave slavery as they get that opportunity in life. I think we actually need to see the way the Bible treats slavery, just like Jesus talks to why divorce was in the Mosaic law, that God makes accommodation for our sinfulness, but it does not mean that God is necessarily endorsing what we are doing. So just in case there was any questions in anyone's mind on that one. Wives is the second group that Peter really talks to as he goes through here. Now, wives didn't necessarily have it quite as bad as slaves, but wives had no legal rights either. They had no standing of their own. They couldn't take a matter to court. They couldn't give testimony in court. They were totally beholden to their husbands as they went through. They had no legal standing of their own right, by and large, as they went through. Yes, there was some women were very wealthy. Some women were able to be smart and influence society considerably, and women had a very proactive role, but they did not have the benefit of legal rights. They were incredibly disempowered, and that's why Paul is talking to them as well in this circumstance of saying that by your lives, you should be thinking about your actions as having a purpose. That even though you don't have that, your actions have a purpose, and that by the way you live, that your husbands are seeing day in, day out the way you live, and that good life actually indicates the difference that has come now that you have become a Christian, and through that can lead to them also becoming a Christian. I think Peter deliberately then finishes in verse 7 with husbands to actually make the point so we don't misinterpret this as saying, I'm glad I'm not a wife. Husbands, if your wives can do all of that, you're expected to also do everything that's there. Live your life with purpose and meaning. But you also have to treat your wives well and live that and totally demonstrate God's love in sacrificial love to your wife as well. So husbands, we're actually called upon to do even more, is how we should very much be reading that, this passage as it goes through. And that's, in fact, for all of us as we go through, is that we are arguably far more empowered than slaves or wives were in the context that Peter was writing. So we certainly should be able to. Submitting to government. Now, Peter's pretty clear in this letter that we need to be submitting to authorities and rulers. And we live in a time where there's certainly lots of challenges in how do we do that, just as Christians then did. Sometimes Christians were forced to, they were brought before the governor or a court and forced to actually pay homage to the emperor, which was worshipping the emperor, to prove that they weren't seditious, to prove that they weren't some sort of atheist that had abandoned all the gods. And that certainly is not Peter saying that you should still worship the emperor as it goes through. But Peter was saying that in their circumstances, they should be living good lives and obeying the law as they go through. So we have challenges in our own bit. Churches in Australia right now are questioning how do they deal with some of the post-COVID restrictions? In New South Wales, the Anglican Church, all churches, in fact, are being forced to check the vaccination status of worshippers. They're having to ask that question, well, whereabouts on that? Is this the start of something that says we're going to exclude people from being able to come and worship freely? There are questions for churches to go through as we deal with that. But in all of this, we need to actually do it within the law and lawfully. Now, one that, if we look back to history from quite some time ago, Bishop Nicholas Ridley was burnt at the stake on the 16th of October, 1555. Now, before he went to the stake, he'd stated in some of his writing that the hearts of princes are in God's hands. Whatsoever God wills, he can make them bow. Now, Ridley was certainly one of the reformers and was pushing for the church to actually change and was breaking away from the Catholicism of Rome. And Ridley definitely saw a separation between Rome, who he associated as pushing the devil's line and being agents of Satan, and the temporal rulers of England, who he saw as potentially being misguided and influenced. But he sought to actually persuade them, and he used all of the methods and the legal methods that he had availed to him, knowing that that was most likely going to end in his death, which it did. So we need to understand that we are still called to be that voice in the wilderness. We are called to speak out for the ethical and the moral issues of what is right, but we need to do so within the law. Now, if I come forward in time to something maybe a little bit more easy for us to relate to today than Bishop Ridley, is we have Martin Luther King, who through the 60s demonstrated a submissive approach to actually calling out the racism that was endemic in his country at that time, and to dealing that, but accepting peacefully within it when the law was used against them for that, to actually, through their good lives, through their good living. And we can contrast that, though, with some of the other behaviours we also see in America, such as pro-Trump protesters this year storming the Capitol building, claiming that they were doing it on behalf of Jesus in a lawless way. I think that's what Peter is calling out and saying. That latter bit of doing it in a lawless manner is definitely not what God is calling to. That is not shining God's way. We don't have to agree with all that government does, but we do need to protest legally, responsibly, and morally, and accept that sometimes that is going to come at a cost to us as we go through. In essence, we need to give the rulers, obey rulers, and give glory to God through what we do. We're not to be revolutionaries. Now, in doing all of this, I think it's really important that we note verse 17 of chapter 2. Show proper respect to everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, honour the emperor. Now, it doesn't come through in our English translations, but in the Greek, I'm assured by friends who are Greek scholars, is that these are imperative commands. They're not suggestions by Peter. They're not, you might want to consider these. These are, you are to. So we are to show proper respect. We are to love the family of believers. And it's really that love the family of believers is a really key thing. Peter's not talking to us as individuals to go away and try really, really hard, because we will all fail if we try really, really hard on our own. We need to support each other. We need to love each other as a family of believers. This is a collective, and it's a collective for us to do. Yes, we will have individual challenges, but we need to be spurring one another on. I encourage you, where you are struggling with sin, where you are struggling with living a good life, talk to other believers. Share with a trusted person that can pray with you, that can help you with that, and share the successes as well as you go through of where you've been able to help to carry each other's burden. This is a really important thing, and it goes back to our sermon from last week, as Peter talked to us last Sunday morning about being living stones made in a wall, that we all have our place and we all need to work together as part of that wall. So what does Peter tell us to do? Peter's telling us in this passage to be set apart, to flee sin that wages war upon us, and to live godly lives for two reasons. One, to be holy for God, but two, so that we can be an effective witness for God. But to finish, Peter isn't telling us to do this just ourselves in the face of persecution. We need to remember the hinge back in chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. For everything in the rest of 1 Peter, we need to keep coming back to chapter 2, 9 and 10. We as Christians have received God's mercy. We must step forward doing this, as Peter exhorts us to do, through Jesus' strength of that mercy.